The small community hall smelled faintly of polished wood and old chairs. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, creating long stripes of light across the worn wooden floor. People were already settling into the rows of chairs, chatting softly, laughing occasionally, and adjusting their cameras or phones. The air was filled with excitement and nervous energy. This was the local music showcase, an annual event where performers of all ages could share their talents. Some came to cheer for friends, others came to see who might be the next big thing. The room buzzed with expectation, but also with a quiet judgment that often accompanies events where people compare themselves and others. Among the crowd, she stood near the back, her hands clutching a worn folder filled with sheet music. Cover was bent at the corners, the edges frayed from years of use. Her shoes were plain, and her jacket slightly oversized, the sleeves falling over her hands. She did not have the kind of appearance that drew attention. In fact, most people barely noticed her as she quietly scanned the room, looking for an empty seat near the stage. She moved slowly, carefully avoiding bumping into anyone. Her presence was subtle, almost invisible compared to the flashy outfits and confident gestures of other performers who would arrive with friends or family cheering loudly behind them. She took a deep breath and stepped closer to the stage. The piano sat at its usual place, its black surface polished, but a few keys looked slightly worn. She ran her fingers over them briefly, as if feeling their history. This piano had been here for years, and she had played on it during previous showcases, but every time felt different. Every time felt like a test. She adjusted the sheet music on the stand, making sure it was perfectly aligned. Her heart beat faster, but her face remained calm. She had practiced this piece hundreds of times, in empty rooms and quiet nights when no one was listening. She had imagined this moment over and over. Imagining it and living it were two very different things. Around her, the audience continued to fill the seats. Some people whispered to each other, pointing at the stage or at other performers warming up. A few children ran past laughing, their shoes squeaking against the floor. The older audience members murmured greetings to friends, their eyes occasionally glancing toward the performers. She noticed the looks directed at her as she stood by the piano. A few eyebrows raised, not out of curiosity, but out of mild skepticism. Some people assumed she was inexperienced, that she might fumble, that she might not belong here. She had felt this kind of doubt before, countless times, whenever she stepped into a room where people expected something flashy, something extraordinary on first glance. But she also knew that appearances could be deceiving. She had learned that lesson early, and she carried it quietly like a shield. The announcer stepped onto the small stage and tapped the microphone, greeting the audience with a bright voice. People clapped politely, and the room quieted down a little. Names were called, one by one, for performers to take the stage. Some performers were greeted with cheers and clapping from friends and family. Others went on quietly, receiving polite applause that felt obligatory more than enthusiastic. When her name was called, there was barely a reaction. A few people looked up with mild interest, others barely noticed, some even shifted in their chairs, checking their phones or whispering to neighbors. She walked forward steadily, holding her folder tightly. Each step felt measured, deliberate, as if every motion mattered. She placed her hands on the piano keys for a moment before sitting down. She looked out at the audience, noticing their faces. Some were smiling politely, some were curious, and a few wore expressions of doubt. She could feel the energy in the room, a mix of expectation and indifference. She knew she had to capture attention, not with her appearance, not with her outfit or charm, but with her music. The first note she played would tell them who she was more than any introduction ever could. Her fingers hovered above the keys, trembling slightly not from fear, but from the surge of energy that came before a performance. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, taking in the silence, letting it fill her senses. The murmurs of the audience faded as her focus sharpened. She remembered all the hours she had spent practicing alone. She remembered evenings when the house was quiet. She would play until her fingers ached, repeating the same passage over and over until it felt perfect. She remembered moments of frustration, times when she thought she would never get it right, and yet she kept going. All of that brought her to this moment. When she pressed the first key, a soft note floated into the room. It was gentle, almost hesitant, but it carried a kind of clarity that made people stop talking for a brief second. She continued, each note deliberate, measured, flowing naturally into the next. The sound was clean, but it also had emotion, a depth that could not be forced. The audience began to notice the subtle intensity in her playing. It was not flashy, not meant to impress immediately, but it drew people in quietly, like a story being told softly that demanded to be heard. Some people leaned forward, curious now. Others still whispered to neighbors, saying things like, "She seems nervous," or "I'm not sure she can do much." She ignored it all, focusing entirely on the piano and the music. She felt a rhythm in her chest, matching the beats of the song she was playing. Her fingers moved smoothly over the keys, and with each note she felt a little more confidence. This was where she belonged. This was the moment she had prepared for. Even if no one else understood its significance yet, the hall began to settle into a quiet that was rare for such a space. Children stopped fidgeting, adults stopped whispering, and even those who had doubted her began to listen more closely. There was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible at first, but real. People began to realize that this performance was not ordinary. It was quiet but commanding, did not scream for attention, but it claimed it. She played on, her hands moving with precision, her posture straight but relaxed. The music was not just notes and rhythm, it was emotion made audible, she thought. About the nights she had spent alone, imagining that one day someone would hear her music and understand the years of struggle behind it. That moment was beginning to arrive. She could see the change in the room, the slight widening of eyes, the pauses in conversation, the small nods of acknowledgement. Her music was starting to speak louder than the doubts that had followed her for so long. Even as she played, she noticed the other performers watching from the wings. Some of them looked surprised, some impressed, others slightly intimidated. They had not expected her to command the room this way, not with her quiet appearance and simple presence. She was not performing for them, but their reactions added a quiet validation. She was more than the assumptions they had made about her. By the time she reached the middle of the piece, the music had taken on a life of its own. It was as if the piano and her had become one entity, telling a story that was bigger than the notes themselves. The audience was no longer listening politely. They were absorbed. They followed every movement of her hands, every shift in tone, every crescendo and pause. The room was no longer filled with murmurs and judgment. It was filled with attention, with anticipation, with the wonder that comes from seeing someone fully immersed in their craft. She noticed small gestures from the audience, a hand covering a mouth in surprise, eyes wide with awe, some heads nodding slowly in appreciation. These small signs gave her strength, but she did not let them distract her. She kept playing, letting the music flow naturally, allowing herself to express everything she had felt and worked for over the years. By the end of the piece, the room had transformed. It was no longer a casual community hall with polite applause and side conversations. It had become a space where people had been taken on a journey they had not expected. She had arrived quietly, underestimated and overlooked, but she had left an impression that would not be forgotten easily. She lifted her hands from the keys and sat for a moment, letting the last vibrations fade into the air. The audience was silent for a heartbeat, stunned by what they had just witnessed. Then, slowly, applause began to grow. It started as a few scattered claps, polite at first, and then swelled into a wave of appreciation that filled the hall. People stood up, cheering and clapping, some with tears in their eyes. The applause was not just for her performance, but for the truth it carried. That talent and dedication often come in quiet, unassuming forms. She smiled softly, a mixture of relief and quiet pride washing over her. She had done what she had come to do. She had let her music speak for her, and it had been heard. For the first time in that hall, she had not been judged by appearance, by hesitation, or by others' expectations. She had been judged by the one thing that mattered, the depth of her talent and the honesty of her expression. As she stood to leave the stage, people approached her, still clapping. Some trying to express their admiration in words that felt inadequate. She nodded, thanked them softly, and made her way back to her seat, feeling lighter than she had in years. The performance was over, but its impact lingered. The quiet girl who had arrived unnoticed had made her mark, and everyone in that room had witnessed a small miracle of focus, talent, and courage. After her first piece ended, she returned to her seat, her hands still tingling from the energy that flowed through the piano. The applause had been warm, but as she sat down, she realized the room's curiosity was not yet fully satisfied. People were still whispering, turning their heads to talk to neighbors, trying to make sense of the quiet power that had filled the hall. Some were astonished that someone so unassuming could command such attention. Others were trying to figure out if it had been a fluke, a lucky moment that might not repeat itself. She, however, knew the truth. It was no fluke. Every note, every pause, every subtle rise and fall of the melody had been earned through years of practice, patience, and persistence. She let herself breathe, letting the last vibrations of the piano settle in the air. While quietly observing the room, her eyes moved across the audience, and she noticed the varied reactions. A group of older musicians in the corner leaned forward slightly, their expressions softening with genuine interest. They had seen many performers, some flashy and confident, some technically skilled but lacking feeling. They were the kind of people who could recognize raw talent when it appeared. She could feel their approval, even though it was quiet and understated. On the other side of the hall, a few teenagers whispered among themselves, skeptical but curious, leaning in a little to see if the next part of the performance would match the first. Somewhere in the back, a young girl clutched her mother's hand tightly, eyes wide, as if seeing a hero for the first time. The room was shifting slowly, subtly, from polite indifference to genuine anticipation. Her thoughts drifted for a moment. Remembering the long nights of practice, the moments when her fingers bled and her wrists ached, the time she spent alone with only the piano and her determination, those quiet hours had shaped her, made her resilient, and now they were speaking through her. She could feel the history of those moments in every part of her body, the tension in her shoulders, the steady beat of her heart, the gentle confidence that had begun to grow. This was more than just playing a song. It was a continuation of her story, a conversation between her and the music that only she could lead. When her name was called again, for the second piece, she rose from her seat calmly. She held her music folder carefully and walked to the piano without a glance at the audience. The murmurs started again, but this time they were quieter. People were paying more attention now, curious to see if she could maintain the level of the first performance. Some of the whispers were doubtful. She played well before, but can she handle something more challenging? It looked simple before. Let's see if she can do a complex piece. Even as those doubts floated through the room, she felt no panic. She had anticipated this. She had been underestimated before, and she had learned how to let her music answer the skeptics without a single word. She placed her hands on the keys and closed her eyes for a brief moment, centering herself. The first note of the second piece sounded, and it was different from the first. It was stronger, more deliberate, but still carried the same emotional depth. She allowed herself to feel the music, to let it flow naturally, without forcing it. This piece was more complex, filled with subtle shifts in tempo and delicate phrasing that required focus and control. Every note demanded attention. Every pause demanded presence. She knew that if she played it well, the audience would not just be impressed, they would be completely captivated. The first few measures went smoothly, and she began to notice the change in the room. The whispers had quieted significantly. People were leaning forward now, their bodies unconsciously drawn to the source of the sound. Eyes were fixed on her hands, watching as they danced across the keys with precision and grace. The older musicians nodded subtly to each other, recognizing the skill behind the performance. She felt their presence not as pressure, but as acknowledgement of the effort and talent she had cultivated over years of quiet practice. Halfway through the piece, the tempo increased slightly, challenging her control and focus. Her fingers moved faster, but each note remained clear and expressive. She was fully aware of the audience now, sensing the shift in energy around her. The initial skepticism had mostly faded, replaced by curiosity and a growing admiration. Even those who had doubted her could no longer ignore the precision and emotion in her playing. They were caught off guard, realizing that the quiet girl in the plain jacket was not just competent, she was exceptional. Her music told a story without words, one that spoke of determination, patience, and quiet strength. She could feel the tension in the room release gradually as people surrendered to the sound. She played with a focus that was almost meditative, losing herself in the rhythm, the melody, the emotion. It was not about showing off or seeking validation. It was about expressing something that only she could express, something that the world had not yet seen. The audience could sense it, even if they could not fully understand it. They felt the authenticity in every note. It demanded their attention. A few young musicians in the audience exchanged glances, their previous skepticism replaced by awe. They whispered to each other in disbelief, realizing that they had misjudged her entirely. The piece continued, flowing from one section to the next, each passage more intricate than the last. Her hands moved almost instinctively, guided by years of muscle memory and a deep emotional connection to the music. She was fully present in the moment, aware of the room, but not distracted by it. The second half of the piece brought a more intense section, with rapid arpeggios and delicate dynamics. She played each note carefully, ensuring that even the fastest passages were clear and expressive. The room felt alive with the sound, as though the music had created an invisible thread connecting everyone present. Even the people who had come with mild interest or casual curiosity could not look away. They were being drawn into the story, whether they wanted to admit it or not. As she approached the climax of the piece, her emotions rose along with the music. Each chord resonated with a sense of purpose, a story of quiet resilience that she had lived through. The audience leaned in collectively, feeling the tension and release as she guided the music through its peaks and valleys. It was not just a technical display, it was a demonstration of her ability to convey something profound and human through sound. People were no longer judging. They were listening, fully and attentively, by the time she reached the final notes. The room was completely silent, except for the lingering vibrations of the piano. Even the air seemed to hold its breath as she allowed the last chord to hang before fading into silence. She lifted her hands slowly, letting the moment settle. The audience did not react immediately. They were caught in the aftershock of what they had just experienced, processing the unexpected depth and mastery they had witnessed. The silence was heavy, not awkward, but full of realization. They had underestimated her, and now they understood why. Then, one by one, the applause began. A soft clap here, a gentle cheer there, building gradually until it became a wave of appreciation that filled the hall. People stood up, clapping and cheering with genuine admiration. Some faces were wet with tears, some were wide-eyed with awe, and others were nodding slowly, acknowledging the undeniable talent before them. She sat quietly, smiling softly, her heart full but calm. She did not need to stand or speak. The music had already done the talking, as the applause continued. She noticed some familiar faces in the audience, other performers, musicians who had doubted her initially. Their expressions had changed from skepticism to respect. They were watching not just a performance, but a demonstration of dedication and authenticity. They had assumed she was ordinary, perhaps even timid, but they were witnessing something extraordinary unfold. She had transformed quiet determination into visible impact, and that shift did not go unnoticed. After a moment, she rose from the piano, acknowledging the audience with a small nod. People continued to cheer, some calling her name, others expressing their admiration in hushed tones as they returned to their seats. She walked back to her chair calmly, her movements deliberate but relaxed. She felt the lingering energy of the performance inside her, a warmth that spread from her hands to her chest. It was a feeling of quiet triumph, one that did not rely on recognition, but on the certainty that she had shared a piece of herself with the world. Sitting back down, she allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. This was the second piece, and already she could see the difference in the room. People who had dismissed her initially were now engaged, curious, and thoughtful. Some approached her after a brief pause to express admiration, their words sincere, their eyes showing that they had been touched in some way. She responded with gratitude, but also with humility, knowing that the true reward was the connection she had created through music. Her thoughts wandered for a moment, remembering the times she had been told she wasn't good enough, the moments when her talent had been overlooked, and the countless hours she had spent alone, practicing in silence. Those experiences had shaped her into the musician she was today, someone who could transform doubt into inspiration. She realized that being underestimated was not a weakness. It had been a challenge, a force that had pushed her to improve, to refine her skill, and to cultivate patience and focus. The audience's reaction was not the end goal, but a reflection of the journey she had taken to arrive at this point. The murmurs and whispers in the hall had changed. Where once there had been doubt and judgment, now there was curiosity, admiration, and respect. People were talking quietly among themselves, sharing impressions and acknowledging that they had misjudged her. It was a subtle but powerful shift, one that she could feel deeply. She had not just played notes on a piano, she had changed perceptions, challenged assumptions, and made people see beyond appearances. As the next performer prepared to take the stage, she remained seated, quietly observing. She noticed how the energy in the room had shifted, how people were paying attention more carefully, how they were listening differently. Her music had set a new standard, one that would influence the way the audience experienced the rest of the showcase. It was a quiet triumph, one that did not demand attention, but commanded it naturally. She breathed deeply, letting the adrenaline slowly settle, feeling a sense of satisfaction that was profound but understated. The journey was far from over, but this moment was a victory, a confirmation that dedication, patience, and authenticity could overcome doubt and skepticism. The second piece had not just been a performance. It had been a statement. It had said, without words, that talent should never be underestimated, that quiet determination could produce extraordinary results, and that the power of music lay not only in its technical skill but in the emotion and honesty behind it. As she prepared for the next stage of the showcase, she felt a renewed sense of confidence. The room had shifted, the audience had shifted, and she had shifted as well. She was no longer just the quiet girl in the plain jacket. She was a musician who had proven herself through her skill, her passion, and her unwavering focus. And as the applause continued to echo softly in her mind, she knew that this was only the beginning of what she could achieve when she let her music speak louder than any doubt. The applause from her second piece still lingered in the hall, soft but persistent. As she quietly returned to her seat, she could feel it in her chest, a warm hum of energy that seemed to flow through her every movement. The audience had begun to shift. Some who had initially doubted her now leaned forward in their chairs, curiosity shining in their eyes. Others whispered to neighbors, sharing their surprise, trying to articulate what they had just experienced. She did not mind the whispers. They were a sign that her music was making people think, that it was leaving an impression deeper than simple entertainment. The third piece was next on her list, and it was perhaps the most challenging one she had ever attempted in front of an audience. It was longer, more intricate, and demanded not only technical precision, but also emotional depth. She could feel the weight of expectations settling onto her shoulders, but it was a different kind of weight this time. It was not the weight of doubt or skepticism, it was the weight of opportunity. She had already proven that her skill was real, but this piece would reveal the full breadth of her ability. She rose quietly when her name was called again, moving to the piano with the same calm demeanor she had maintained before. As she approached, she noticed the subtle changes in the audience. Eyes that had once wandered were now focused on her every step. Heads that had been turned toward the doors or phones now followed her closely, curious to see what she would do next. The group of older musicians nodded slightly to one another, as if silently acknowledging that something extraordinary was about to happen. She smiled softly, letting their quiet encouragement fuel her confidence. Sitting down, she opened her music folder with care, her fingers brushing lightly over the sheet music. The piano keys, worn in some places but still reliable, awaited her touch. She let her hands hover above them for a moment, taking in the atmosphere of the room, feeling the anticipation vibrating through the audience. She closed her eyes briefly, centering herself, imagining the melody as it would flow through her hands and fill the hall. The first note she played was soft but precise, like a whisper that demanded attention. As the music began to unfold, it was immediately clear that this was not a continuation of the previous pieces, but something entirely new. It was bold, yet subtle, intricate, yet fluid. Her fingers moved with confidence and grace, each note carefully articulated but never forced. The audience, sensing the complexity and emotion in her playing, grew quiet. The whispers faded, replaced by the gentle hum of concentration and anticipation. People leaned forward in their seats, captivated not just by the sound, but by the story the music was telling. This piece had moments of calm reflection and moments of dramatic intensity. As her hands glided across the keys, she could feel the rhythm of the music guiding her. It was as though the piano had become an extension of herself, translating her thoughts and emotions into sound. Every rise and fall of the melody carried meaning. Every pause held significance. The audience, now fully engaged, began to recognize the depth of her talent. It was not just technical skill that impressed them, it was the emotion, the honesty, the way she made the music breathe with life. A few young musicians in the audience exchanged looks of awe. They had assumed they knew what to expect, but she was rewriting their expectations with every note. Even those who were seasoned performers themselves could not hide their surprise. They whispered softly to each other, acknowledging that they had underestimated her entirely. Her quiet presence, her unassuming appearance, had masked a level of skill and emotional expression that few had anticipated. The middle section of the piece brought a sudden shift, a cascade of rapid notes that tested both speed and accuracy. Her fingers danced across the keys, hitting each note with clarity and control. There was no hesitation, no faltering. Every note landed exactly as she intended. The audience sat in stunned silence, absorbing the beauty and complexity of what they were witnessing. Some eyes widened in amazement, some mouths fell open slightly, and some simply leaned forward, unable to look away. The music demanded their full attention, and it received it. She allowed herself to feel the intensity of the piece, letting it flow through her without restraint. The hall seemed to transform around her, the walls echoing with sound, the air vibrating with energy. People were no longer judging, they were experiencing. They were living the story she was telling with each chord, each arpeggio, each gentle pause. She had learned that music could communicate emotions words often fail to express, and now she was proving it in the most powerful way possible as the piece progressed. She noticed subtle changes in the audience. Some who had initially been skeptical were now leaning in, their bodies tense with attention. A few older audience members who had spent decades observing performers whispered quietly to each other, nodding as if acknowledging that they were witnessing something rare. The young girl who had clutched her mother's hand earlier now sat on the edge of her seat, eyes wide with wonder. People were being drawn in not just by the technical brilliance of the performance, but by the raw, unfiltered emotion that came through each note. There was a moment near the climax when the music shifted into a slower, more reflective passage. Her hands moved delicately across the keys, drawing out each note with precision and care. The audience held their breath, sensing the tension and release that was about to come. She felt it too, the culmination of all the practice, all the quiet hours alone with the piano, all the moments of doubt that had now been transformed into strength. This was the moment where the music spoke louder than any words, louder than any judgment, louder than any expectation. As the final notes approached, she felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of exhilaration and serenity. She played with everything she had, pouring her heart into the music. Each chord resonated, filling the room with a richness that seemed to linger long after the keys had been released. The audience was captivated, their focus unbroken, their attention absolute. They were experiencing something rare, a performance that was not just skillful, but profoundly human, filled with vulnerability, passion, and authenticity. When the last chord faded, there was a moment of complete silence. The kind of silence that is heavy, almost sacred, a pause that lets the impact of what has just been experienced sink in fully. People did not move immediately. They were processing, absorbing, reflecting. Some closed their eyes, some looked at the performer with awe, some simply sat still, caught in the afterglow of the music. The silence itself spoke volumes, louder than any applause could have. It was the moment where everyone in the room understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Then, slowly, the applause began. A soft clap here, a gentle cheer there, gradually growing into a wave of appreciation that filled the hall. People rose to their feet, some with tears in their eyes, some with expressions of disbelief, some with smiles of admiration. They were cheering not just for the technical brilliance of the performance, but for the courage, dedication, and emotional honesty that had brought it to life. The quiet girl who had been underestimated had completely transformed the energy in the room. She stood, acknowledging the applause with a calm, graceful nod. There was no need for words, her music had already spoken for her. People continued to clap, some calling her name softly, others offering words of admiration as they returned to their seats. She felt a profound sense of connection with the audience, a recognition that the effort and emotion she had poured into the performance had reached them deeply. It was a quiet triumph, one that required no fanfare, no flashy gestures, just the honest power of her talent as she returned to her seat. She noticed the subtle changes in the audience. The skeptics had been silenced, replaced by admiration and curiosity. Friends and strangers alike were discussing the performance in hushed tones, sharing their impressions and trying to articulate what they had just experienced. The energy in the room had shifted, transformed by the music, and she could feel it resonate around her. This was more than just a showcase. It was a moment of revelation. It's a demonstration of what quiet determination and passion could achieve. Her thoughts drifted for a moment, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She remembered the times she had been underestimated, the moments when her talent had been overlooked, the long hours of solitary practice, sacrifices she had made to pursue her passion. All of it had led to this moment where her music could not only impress, but truly move people. She realized that being underestimated had not been a weakness, it had been a challenge, one that had pushed her to grow stronger, more focused and more expressive around her. The room was alive with a new energy. Other performers prepared nervously, aware that the standard had been raised by the quiet girl who had just performed. The audience was more attentive, more engaged, more open to the possibility of being surprised. She could sense it, the impact of her performance extending beyond the notes, influencing the entire atmosphere, changing expectations, and inspiring attention. It was a subtle, powerful shift, one that she had orchestrated with nothing but her music and her dedication. As the next performer approached the stage, she allowed herself a moment to breathe and reflect. She had proven something important, not just her technical skill, but the power of resilience, the ability to turn quiet effort into visible impact, and the importance of staying true to oneself. She had faced doubt and skepticism, and had emerged stronger, transforming assumptions and captivating the hearts of those who had underestimated her. The experience was both humbling and empowering, a reminder of why she loved music and why she had dedicated herself so fully to her craft. Even as the applause continued to echo softly, she felt a sense of calm satisfaction. This was more than recognition, it was understanding. The audience had seen not just the music, but the story behind it. The years of dedication and quiet perseverance that had brought her to this point. She had transformed doubt into admiration, skepticism into awe, and ordinary moments into something extraordinary. And as she sat quietly, letting the energy of the room settle, she knew that this performance was only a part of her journey, a step in a path defined by talent, dedication, and authenticity. The hall was quiet now, almost reverent. As the applause from her previous piece faded, people were still talking softly, sharing their impressions, some shaking their heads in disbelief. She sat in her chair for a moment, letting the energy from the audience settle around her. The realization that she had captured their attention, not just with technical skill, but with the emotion in her music, gave her a quiet sense of satisfaction. Yet she knew this was not the end. There was still one more piece, one more moment, one more opportunity to show them the depth of her ability. When her name was called for the fourth performance, a hush fell over the room. People had become accustomed to expecting something extraordinary from her, but anticipation now carried weight. The whispers had changed. They were no longer skeptical, but filled with curiosity, excitement, and a little bit of awe. Some audience members straightened in their chairs, leaning forward slightly as if to catch every detail of what was about to unfold. She rose calmly, carrying her worn music folder. Her movements deliberate and confident, though her heart raced with the same thrill it always did before performing. The piano keys looked familiar and welcoming, almost like old friends ready to support her. She placed her hands gently on the keys, closing her eyes for a moment to center herself. This piece was different from the others. It was long, dramatic, and emotionally intense, requiring not just precision, but deep expression. Every note carried meaning. Every pause demanded attention. She had spent countless hours preparing it, memorizing the smallest details, practicing the crescendos and diminuendos until they felt natural. This was the moment where everything she had learned would come together, and she could feel it in the way the air seemed to thrum with expectation. The first notes she played were soft, almost tentative, as if testing the room. But within moments the music grew, unfolding like a story, each chord a sentence, each melody a paragraph. The audience fell silent, drawn in by the delicate but powerful introduction. She could feel their attention, and she allowed it to guide her without controlling it. Her hands moved fluidly across the keys, each motion precise yet expressive, telling a story that words could not capture. People who had once doubted her now sat captivated, their eyes fixed on her fingers and the music that emerged from them. The piece shifted suddenly, the melody becoming more urgent, more intense. Her fingers danced over the keys with speed and control, executing rapid passages that required both skill and focus. The audience held their breath, caught in the sudden surge of sound and emotion. It was a moment of suspense, a challenge not only for her hands but for her ability to convey the tension within the music. She felt it herself, the thrill of the performance, the way the notes connected her to the audience, the way the piano seemed to become an extension of her thoughts and feelings. With every passing measure, the music grew richer and more layered. She played with a combination of strength and delicacy, alternating between forceful chords that shook the room and gentle, almost whispered phrases that demanded careful listening. The audience responded unconsciously, their bodies leaning forward, their faces showing concentration, awe, and wonder. Even those who were seated far back seemed unable to look away, drawn in by the emotional power of the performance. It was no longer just music. It was an experience, shared journey between the performer and everyone in the room. There were moments of quiet reflection in the piece, where her fingers hovered over the keys before releasing each note with care. These moments were as important as the louder, more dramatic sections. They allowed the audience to breathe, to feel, to absorb the depth of the story she was telling. People closed their eyes, some letting the music wash over them, some nodding slightly, as if acknowledging the subtle beauty of the composition. She noticed these small gestures and felt a sense of connection, a silent understanding that the music had reached them halfway through. The piece transitioned into a fast, intricate section that tested every aspect of her skill. Her fingers moved with precision and speed, executing difficult arpeggios and runs without hesitation. The room seemed to vibrate with energy, as if the music had taken on a physical presence that could be felt in the bones. The audience was spellbound, silent, but completely engaged, their focus unwavering. Even those who had doubted her most could not look away, caught in the complexity and emotion of her playing. The music shifted again, becoming more emotional and expressive. She leaned into each phrase, letting the notes carry her feelings outward, sharing her story with the room. There was a sense of vulnerability in the way she played, an honesty that could not be faked or imitated. People could feel it, and it created a bond between the performer and the audience. She could sense their emotions shifting alongside hers, their anticipation, their admiration, their awe. It was a powerful connection, one that made the entire hall feel alive with the music. As the piece approached its climax, the tension increased. Her fingers flew across the keys, executing complex passages with flawless precision. Yet each note carried emotion, not just technique. The audience was completely captivated, silent except for the sound of the piano and the subtle gasps that occasionally slipped through. Some people leaned forward in their seats, some closed their eyes, some held their breath, all fully immersed in the performance. It was the kind of music that demanded attention, that left no room for distraction. It made everyone present feel the intensity of the moment. The climax itself was breathtaking. She played with both power and finesse, filling the room with sound that was at once overwhelming and beautiful. The chords resonated deeply, vibrating through the floor and the walls, creating an almost physical presence. The audience was completely absorbed, many holding their hands to their chests or mouths, unable to fully process the emotion that had been conveyed. Her hands moved with confidence, guided by instinct and years of disciplined practice. Letting the music flow naturally, yet with deliberate control. Then came the resolution. The final notes that brought the piece to a close. She allowed the music to taper gradually, softening each chord, letting it fade gently into silence. The room was still held captive by the lingering vibrations and the emotional impact of what they had just heard. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The silence itself was powerful, a testament to the effect of her performance. It was a quiet pause, almost sacred. A moment for the audience to absorb the full weight of the experience. And then the applause began. It started softly, hesitant at first, but grew quickly into a thunderous wave of sound. People stood, clapping and cheering, their admiration spilling over in a way that could not be contained. Some faces were wet with tears, some were wide-eyed with amazement, and some simply smiled. Overwhelmed by the beauty and intensity of the performance, she rose from the piano, acknowledging the audience with a calm nod, her face reflecting a mixture of pride, relief, and humility. The applause continued, unrelenting, as if the audience could not let go of the feeling her music had created. The impact of the performance extended beyond mere admiration. People approached her quietly, expressing their awe, their respect, their recognition of the talent they had once underestimated. Some offered words of apology for their initial doubts. Others simply smiled, acknowledging the extraordinary display of skill and emotion. She responded with grace and gratitude, letting her music speak where words could not. The connection she had created through her performance was deeper than applause or recognition. It was understanding, shared experience, and emotional resonance. As she returned to her seat, she noticed the subtle shifts in the room. The audience had changed. People were more attentive, more engaged, more respectful. The other performers prepared with a heightened awareness, sensing that the standard had been set at a level that demanded attention. Even the skeptics were now silent, their previous doubts replaced by acknowledgement and curiosity. She could feel the influence of her performance spreading, changing the atmosphere of the hall, shaping the expectations of everyone present. She allowed herself a moment to reflect on the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the countless hours of practice, the sacrifices she had made, the moments of doubt and uncertainty. All of it had led to this moment, a performance that was not just technical, but deeply human, expressive, and transformative. She realized that the moments of being underestimated had been crucial, shaping her into a musician capable of captivating hearts and minds, capable of transforming doubt into admiration, skepticism into awe. The applause gradually subsided, leaving the hall filled with a quiet energy, a lingering sense of impact. People were still talking softly, sharing impressions, acknowledging the performance, and processing the depth of what they had witnessed. She sat calmly, letting it all wash over her, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a mission accomplished. This piece had not just been about showing skill, it had been about connecting, about expressing something that transcended mere notes on a page, about creating a shared experience that would remain in the memory of the audience long after the final chord had faded. Even as the next performer approached the piano, she remained seated, quietly observing. She noticed the subtle reverence in the audience, the heightened attention, the sense of anticipation for what was to come. Her performance had changed the tone of the showcase, elevating it from a casual event to an experience of artistry and emotion. She had achieved more than applause. She had created a moment of recognition, a space where talent, dedication, and authenticity were honored and celebrated.